You think you know what evil looks like in history? You've learned about the worst tyrants, seen the documentaries, felt the appropriate horror. But what if I told you there was a systematic practice so twisted, so methodically cruel that it makes everything else look like a playground dispute? What if there was a man whose job description was literally destroying children for imperial pleasure? Today we're diving into the story of Hassan the Cutter, the Ottoman Empire's most notorious castrator, whose blade carved a path of suffering through thousands of young lives. This isn't some distant fairy tale or Hollywood fiction. This is documented history that makes modern nightmares seem quaint. We're talking about a man who perfected the art of human mutilation, who turned childhood into commodity, who served an empire that treated boys like livestock. And the most disturbing part? He wasn't some rogue monster operating in the shadows. He was an official of the Ottoman court, paid by the Sultan's treasury, protected by imperial law. The year was 1520, and in a stone chamber beneath the Topkapi Palace, the sound of children screaming echoed through corridors where sultans once walked. But these weren't cries of play or excitement. These were the death rattles of innocence, the soundtrack of an empire that had industrialized the destruction of human souls. Hassan stood over another victim, his blade catching the torchlight, his face as calm as a butcher preparing meat for market. Before we dive into this historical nightmare, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't taught in any classroom. It's the raw, unfiltered truth about how powerful men throughout history have treated the powerless. This is the story they don't want preserved, the evil they'd rather forget. But forgetting means it could happen again. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer territories, it conquered childhood itself, turning boys into broken servants through systematic mutilation. And Hassan the Cutter was their master craftsman, the architect of agony who perfected techniques that would make modern war criminals weep. His story reveals depths of human cruelty that most people can't even imagine. Picture this scene from a Tuesday morning in Constantinople. The market square buzzes with normal activity. Merchants hawk their wares, children play between the stalls, mothers bargain for bread. But in the shadows, Hassan's agents move through the crowd with practiced eyes. They're not shopping for goods. They're shopping for boys. Young, healthy, beautiful boys who will disappear forever into the empire's appetite for broken servants. The selection process was an art form of predation. Hassan had developed criteria that would make modern human traffickers jealous. Age between 8 and 14, the sweet spot where bodies were resilient enough to survive the procedure, but minds were malleable enough to accept their fate. Physical beauty was essential because scarred or deformed boys wouldn't command premium prices in the slave markets. Intelligence mattered too, since the Sultan preferred servants who could learn quickly and follow complex orders. But here's what most people don't realize about Hassan's operation. This wasn't some back-alley butcher shop run by a madman. This was a sophisticated medical facility that operated with the precision of a modern hospital and the cruelty of a torture chamber. Hassan had studied anatomy, perfected his techniques through hundreds of procedures, developed recovery methods that maximize survival rates. He was, in the most twisted sense possible, a master of his craft. The preparation chamber tells its own horror story. Stone tables designed for restraint, specially forged instruments that combined surgical precision with maximum pain, recovery areas where the lucky survivors would spend weeks healing from trauma that would define the rest of their lives. Hassan had thought of everything, from the angle of the cuts to the herbs used for preventing infection. Every detail calculated to produce the perfect broken servant. The boys who entered Hassan's chamber came from across the empire and beyond. Slavic children captured in raids, African boys purchased from traders, Greek youths seized from coastal villages. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, dreamed different dreams. But they all shared one fate once Hassan's agents marked them for collection. They would leave his chamber forever changed if they left at all. Let me tell you about Mehmet, originally named Dmitri before his capture. At 12 years old, he was the son of a Byzantine merchant, destined for a life of trade and family. His father had been teaching him to read accounts. His mother had been planning his betrothal to a neighbor's daughter. But none of that mattered when Ottoman raiders swept through his village in 1518. His parents were killed, his sisters taken for different purposes, and Dmitri found himself chained in a wagon, bound for Constantinople. The journey to Hassan's chamber was itself a filter of suffering. Boys too weak to survive the march were abandoned along the roadside. Those who fell ill were left to die rather than risk contaminating the valuable cargo. By the time Dmitri reached the capital, he'd watched half his fellow captives perish from disease, exhaustion, or simple despair. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Hassan's first meeting with new arrivals was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He would examine each boy like a horse trader, inspecting livestock, checking teeth, feeling muscle tone, assessing overall health. But he also studied their faces, their reactions, their spirit. Boys who showed too much defiance might face special treatment. Those who seemed too broken might be rejected as poor investment risks. Hassan needed subjects who would survive the procedure but submit to their new reality. The waiting period before the procedure was calculated torture. Boys were fed well to build strength for the ordeal ahead, but they were also told exactly what would happen to them. Hassan believed that anticipation increased compliance, that boys who understood their fate would be less likely to resist when the moment came. Some begged, others tried to escape. A few attempted to end their own lives rather than face what awaited them. Hassan had seen it all, and his response was always the same cold professionalism. Here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Hassan didn't just perform these procedures out of duty or even sadism. He took pride in his work, the way a master craftsman takes pride in creating something beautiful. He kept detailed records of his techniques, survival rates, recovery times. He experimented with different methods to improve outcomes, not out of mercy for his victims, but to increase the value of his finished products. The procedure itself was designed for maximum efficiency rather than minimum suffering. Hassan had calculated that speed was more important than gentleness, that quick, decisive action produced better survival rates than careful, gradual cutting. The boys were restrained but conscious throughout the ordeal, partly because anesthesia didn't exist, but partly because Hassan believed awareness helped prevent shock-induced death. The survival rate tells its own story of systematic horror. Under Hassan's refined techniques, approximately 70% of boys survived the initial procedure. This was considered an impressive improvement over earlier methods that killed 9 out of 10 victims. But survival meant something very different in Hassan's chamber than it would in any reasonable context. Survival meant living with permanent physical and psychological damage, with the knowledge that your body had been deliberately broken to serve another man's pleasure. The recovery process revealed Hassan's twisted mercy. Boys who survived the cutting faced weeks of careful monitoring, special diets, herbal treatments to prevent infection. Hassan wanted his products to heal properly, to regain enough strength to be useful. He would personally check on recovering patients, adjusting treatments based on their progress. To an outside observer, it might have looked like medical care. In reality, it was quality control for human merchandise. Those who recovered fully entered a world that defied normal human experience. They were no longer boys in any meaningful sense, but they weren't men either. They existed in a liminal space between male and female, between human and object, between person and property. The Ottoman court had created an entire category of being that existed solely to serve imperial pleasure without the inconvenience of human desires or ambitions. But Hassan's work extended beyond the individual procedures. He was part of a larger system that had industrialized human suffering on a scale that makes modern atrocities look amateur. The Ottoman Empire had perfected the art of breaking children, turning trauma into tradition, making mutilation into law. Hassan was just one cog in a machine that consumed thousands of young lives every year. The economic calculations behind Hassan's operation reveal the true depth of this evil. Each successfully castrated boy could be sold for 10 times the price of an intact slave. The investment in Hassan's services, his equipment, his facilities, all of it paid for itself many times over through the premium prices commanded by his finished products. The empire had discovered that destroying children was incredibly profitable. This wasn't ancient history happening in some primitive time when people didn't know better. This was the 16th century, when Renaissance artists were creating masterpieces, when scholars were rediscovering classical learning, when explorers were mapping new worlds. While Europe was experiencing cultural rebirth, the Ottoman Empire was perfecting the systematic destruction of human potential on an industrial scale. Hassan the Cutter represents something darker than individual evil. He represents what happens when systematic cruelty becomes normalized, when human suffering becomes bureaucratized, when childhood itself becomes a commodity to be harvested and processed. His story is a window into depths of organized evil that most people prefer not to contemplate. The boys who survived Hassan's chamber went on to serve in the Sultan's court, but their survival came at a cost that can't be calculated in gold or silver. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies had been deliberately broken, that their capacity for human connection had been surgically removed, that they existed solely to serve the pleasure of the man who had ordered their mutilation. But we're just getting started with this horror story. Hassan's individual cruelty was nothing compared to the systematic evil of the empire he served. The procedures, the selection process, the recovery methods, all of it was just the beginning of a nightmare that stretched across centuries and consumed millions of lives. Because Hassan wasn't working alone, and his victims weren't random targets. They were part of a calculated program of human destruction that had been refined over generations, perfected through centuries of practice, institutionalized as normal government policy. The Ottoman Empire had turned the breaking of children into a science, and Hassan was their most skilled practitioner. The question isn't just how one man could commit such atrocities. The question is how an entire civilization could build itself around the systematic destruction of human innocence, how they could turn childhood into a raw material for imperial pleasure, how they could make monsters like Hassan into respected officials rather than reviled criminals. The answer lies in understanding how the Ottoman system normalized horror through bureaucracy. Hassan didn't wake up one day and decide to mutilate children. He was trained, educated, and molded by an empire that had spent centuries perfecting the art of human destruction. His techniques were passed down from master to apprentice like any other craft, complete with instruction manuals, quality standards, and professional advancement opportunities. The training process for imperial castrators reveals the systematic nature of this evil. Young men, often from conquered territories themselves, would apprentice under master cutters like Hassan for years before being trusted with their own blade. They learned anatomy through dissection of corpses, practiced techniques on condemned criminals, studied the empire's detailed records of successful and failed procedures. By the time they graduated to full practitioners, they had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that mutilating children seemed like normal professional duty. Hassan's rise through the ranks tells us everything about how systematic evil perpetuates itself. He began as an assistant, cleaning instruments and disposing of bodies. He progressed to restraining victims while his master worked. Eventually, he was allowed to perform minor cuts under supervision. Each step normalized the horror a little more, until the screaming of children became just another workplace sound, no more disturbing than the ringing of hammers in a blacksmith shop. The empire's record-keeping reveals the industrial scale of this operation. Ottoman archives contain detailed inventories of castrated boys sorted by age, origin, and physical characteristics. They tracked survival rates by region, noting that Circassian boys had better recovery statistics than African captives. They documented which techniques produced the most valuable servants, which seasonal timing reduced infection rates, which preparation methods increased compliance. This wasn't random cruelty, this was systematic research into optimizing human suffering. But the true genius of Ottoman evil lay not in the individual procedures, but in how they created an entire economic ecosystem around broken children. Hassan was just one link in a supply chain that stretched from the slave markets of Crimea to the pleasure palaces of Constantinople. Traders specialized in locating suitable boys. Transport specialists moved them efficiently across vast distances. Medical practitioners like Hassan processed them into finished products. Palace officials distributed them according to imperial needs. The demand side of this market reveals depths of depravity that challenge comprehension. The Sultan himself maintained hundreds of castrated boys for various purposes, from bedroom attendants to ceremonial guards. High-ranking officials competed to acquire the most beautiful broken servants as status symbols. Wealthy merchants purchased them as household staff who could be trusted around women without risk of romantic entanglements. The entire Ottoman elite had built their lifestyle around the availability of mutilated children. Hassan's clients included some of the most powerful men in the empire. The Grand Vizier regularly commissioned special orders for particularly attractive boys captured in specific regions. Military commanders requested large batches for their personal retinues. Even religious leaders who publicly condemned such practices privately maintained households staffed with Hassan's handiwork. The hypocrisy was so complete that it became invisible to those who benefited from it. The pricing structure for Hassan's services reveals the calculated nature of this horror. Basic castration of common boys cost 50 gold pieces. Premium procedures for exceptionally beautiful subjects commanded 200. Rush orders for urgent palace needs carried surcharges. Volume discounts applied for military contracts requiring dozens of servants. Hassan had turned human mutilation into a profitable business with standardized rates and professional service guarantees. The geographic reach of Hassan's operations stretched across 3 continents. His agents operated permanent procurement stations in major slave markets from Kaffa to Cairo. Special expeditions were mounted to acquire boys from specific ethnic groups when palace fashion demanded particular types of servants. The logistics required to maintain this supply chain rivaled those of major military campaigns, complete with secure transportation, medical support, and quality control inspections. But individual procurement was only part of Hassan's operation. The empire had also systematized the mass collection of boys through the devshirme system, essentially a human tax paid in children. Christian villages across the Balkans were required to surrender their most promising boys every few years. These weren't random raids or market purchases. This was organized government policy that treated human children like any other natural resource to be harvested for imperial use. The selection criteria for devshirme victims reveal the calculating precision of Ottoman evil. Boys had to be between 8 and 18 years old, physically perfect, and demonstrably intelligent. They couldn't be the only sons of their families because the empire needed those villages to remain productive. They had to come from rural areas where resistance would be minimal and witnesses few. Every aspect was calculated to maximize the harvest while minimizing disruption to the systems that produced more victims. Hassan personally oversaw many devshirme collections, traveling to remote villages with armed escorts and portable surgical equipment. The procedure would begin with village elders forced to present all eligible boys for inspection. Hassan would examine each candidate like a horse trader evaluating livestock, checking teeth, muscle tone, and general health. Those selected would be immediately separated from their families and prepared for transport to Constantinople. The psychological warfare of devshirme collection was as brutal as the physical procedures that followed. Parents were forced to watch their sons selected for mutilation while being powerless to intervene. Brothers and friends saw their companions chosen while knowing they might be next. Entire communities lived in terror of the periodic visits from Hassan's teams, never knowing when their children would be harvested for imperial pleasure. The transport phase of devshirme operations was itself a filtering process that killed thousands before they ever reached Hassan's chamber. Boys were chained together and forced to march hundreds of miles in all weather conditions. Those who fell behind were abandoned. Those who became ill were left to die rather than slow the caravan. By the time the survivors reached Constantinople, they had already been broken by weeks of brutality and the knowledge that their families were forever lost. Hassan's preparation of devshirme victims involved special psychological techniques designed to ensure compliance. Boys were told that resistance was futile, that their families had sold them voluntarily, that service to the Sultan was the highest honor they could achieve. Some believed these lies and submitted willingly. Others required more direct persuasion through methods that would violate every modern convention on the treatment of prisoners. The scale of the devshirme system dwarfs individual market transactions. Every 3 to 5 years, thousands of boys would be collected across the empire and delivered to processing centers like Hassan's facility. The logistics required massive coordination between military units, local administrators, transport specialists, and medical practitioners. This wasn't the work of isolated monsters. This was industrial-scale child abuse, orchestrated by one of history's most sophisticated governments. But even the Dievshirme system was just one component of a larger apparatus designed to consume human innocence on an unprecedented scale. The Ottoman Empire had created multiple pathways for acquiring children, multiple methods for breaking them, multiple markets for distributing the finished products. Hassan was both architect and instrument of a system that had mechanized human suffering to a degree that challenges modern comprehension. The survivors of Hassan's procedures faced a lifetime of serving the men who had ordered their mutilation. They became living reminders of the empire's power to break anyone, to reduce human beings to objects, to turn childhood itself into a commodity. Their existence validated the entire system by demonstrating that even the most extreme cruelty could be normalized, systematized, and made profitable. Yet this was still just the beginning of our journey into the depths of Ottoman evil. Hassan's individual techniques, however refined, were nothing compared to the institutional machinery that supported his work. The empire had created an entire civilization based on the systematic destruction of human potential, and we've only begun to explore how deep that rabbit hole really goes. The question that should terrify us isn't just how Hassan could commit such atrocities with clinical precision. The question is how an entire society could build itself around such practices, how they could turn the screams of children into the soundtrack of imperial glory, how they could make the breaking of innocence into the foundation of their civilization's power. The records that survive from Hassan's operation read like inventory lists from hell. Ottoman archivists, with their obsessive attention to bureaucratic detail, documented every aspect of the castration industry with the same meticulous care they applied to tax collection or military logistics. These weren't the ravings of a madman hidden in some basement. These were official government documents stamped with imperial seals, filed in organized archives that still exist today. One ledger from 1523 lists Hassan's monthly quota. 200 boys processed, survival rate documented at 68%, with detailed breakdowns by age, ethnicity, and final destination. The clinical language mass horrors that would make modern war crimes investigators weep. Entry 47 reads simply, Circassian male, age 11, excellent condition, delivered to Grand Vizier's household. Behind those sterile words was a child whose life had been deliberately destroyed for another man's convenience. The pricing schedules reveal the economic calculation behind every scream. Premium boys from the Caucasus commanded 800 gold pieces after processing. Standard Slavic captives brought 400. African children, considered less valuable by Ottoman standards, sold for 200. Hassan received 20% commission on each sale, making him one of the wealthiest men in Constantinople. His fortune was built on a foundation of mutilated children, but money was just one measure of Hassan's success within the imperial system. The Sultan personally recognized his achievements with ceremonial titles and palace privileges. Hassan the Cutter became Hassan Pasha, honored with his own wing in the Topkapi complex, granted audiences with the most powerful men in the empire. The same hands that had destroyed thousands of children were kissed by nobles seeking favor at court. The normalization of Hassan's work within Ottoman society reveals how systematic evil embeds itself in civilization. Palace guards, who once might have been horrified by screaming children, learned to ignore the sounds emanating from Hassan's chambers. Servants who delivered food to recovery rooms grew accustomed to the sight of broken boys. Administrators who processed sales documents treated human castration as routine paperwork. Each person involved became complicit through gradual exposure until horror became ordinary. The training academy Hassan established represents the institutionalization of his methods. Young men from across the empire competed for positions as apprentice castrators, viewing it as a path to wealth and status. The curriculum Hassan developed covered anatomy, surgical technique, patient management, and business practices. Graduates received certificates of competency and recommendations for positions throughout the Ottoman territories. The empire had turned child mutilation into a respectable profession with career advancement opportunities. Hassan's instructional manual, preserved in the Istanbul State Archives, provides chilling insight into the systematic nature of his work. Chapter headings include optimal restraint techniques, seasonal considerations for recovery, and managing client expectations. The text reads like a medical textbook written by a demon, combining technical precision with complete disregard for human suffering. Future generations of castrators would learn their craft from Hassan's written wisdom. The apprenticeship program Hassan oversaw produced dozens of skilled practitioners who spread his techniques across the empire. Former students established castration centers in Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Tunis. Each facility operated according to Hassan's standardized procedures, ensuring consistent quality regardless of location. The Ottoman Empire had franchised human mutilation with the efficiency of a modern corporation. The medical innovations Hassan developed were studied and copied throughout the Islamic world. His techniques for preventing infection reduced mortality rates significantly, making castration a more profitable enterprise. His methods for managing pain, while not motivated by mercy, improved survival statistics that translated directly into increased revenue. Hassan had solved the technical challenges of mass human mutilation through scientific methodology applied to evil purposes. The supply chain Hassan coordinated stretched from the slave markets of Crimea to the auction blocks of Alexandria. Procurement agents in dozens of cities reported directly to his Constantinople headquarters. Transport specialists moved human cargo according to his specifications. Local administrators processed documentation according to his standardized forms. The entire operation functioned with the precision of a well-oiled machine designed to consume children. Regional variations in Hassan's operation reveal the adaptability of systematic evil. In North African territories, his agents focused on capturing boys from Nubian kingdoms. In European provinces, the Dev-Shirme system provided steady supplies of Christian children. In Asian territories, mountain tribes were raided specifically for their attractive young males. Hassan had customized his procurement strategies to exploit the vulnerabilities of each population under Ottoman control. The seasonal cycles of Hassan's work followed agricultural patterns that maximized efficiency. Spring raids captured boys weakened by winter privation. Summer campaigns targeted pastoral communities when families were scattered across grazing lands. Autumn collections coincided with harvest seasons when villages were distracted by urgent agricultural work. Hassan had synchronized human predation with natural cycles to optimize his hunting success. The quality control measures Hassan implemented ensured consistent output from his operation. Boys who arrived damaged from transport were either rejected or processed at reduced rates. Those who showed signs of disease were quarantined until healthy or eliminated to prevent contamination. Standards for age, appearance, and physical condition were rigidly enforced. Hassan treated human beings like manufactured goods, subject to inspection and quality assurance protocols. The distribution network Hassan managed delivered finished products to customers across 3 continents. Palace officials received premium selections for imperial use. Military commanders acquired bulk quantities for their personal retinues. Wealthy merchants purchased household servants guaranteed free from romantic complications. Religious leaders, despite public condemnation of such practices, privately maintained staffs of castrated boys. The hypocrisy was so complete it became invisible. The customer service aspects of Hassan's operation included warranties and replacement guarantees. Boys who died within 30 days of delivery would be replaced at no charge. Those who failed to meet specifications could be returned for partial refund. Bulk purchasers received volume discounts and priority access to premium selections. Hassan had applied commercial principles to human trafficking with ruthless efficiency. The record-keeping Hassan maintained tracked every aspect of his operation with bureaucratic precision. Individual files documented each boy's origin, processing date, recovery progress, and final sale. Statistical summaries analyzed trends in survival rates, pricing, and customer satisfaction. Annual reports to palace administrators demonstrated the profitability and efficiency of the castration program. Hassan had quantified human suffering with the same attention to detail that merchants applied to grain sales. The international reputation Hassan developed attracted clients from beyond the Ottoman Empire. Persian nobles commissioned special orders for particularly beautiful boys. Mamluk sultans in Egypt purchased trained servants for their harems. Even European merchants, despite official Christian condemnation, secretly acquired castrated boys for their Mediterranean trading posts. Hassan's brand had become synonymous with quality in the international market for mutilated children. The technological innovations Hassan pioneered improved both efficiency and profitability of his operation. Specialized restraint devices reduced the manpower required for procedures. Improved surgical instruments decreased operation time and increased survival rates. Enhanced recovery facilities allowed for higher patient throughput. Hassan had applied engineering principles to optimize human destruction. The psychological techniques Hassan developed broke boys' spirits as systematically as his blade broke their bodies. Isolation from other children prevented mutual support and resistance. Constant reminders of their helplessness destroyed hope of escape or rescue. Promises of eventual privilege for compliance created false incentives for cooperation. Hassan understood that controlling minds was as important as controlling bodies. The training Hassan provided to his victims prepared them for lives of absolute subservience. Boys were taught palace etiquette, household management, and personal service techniques. They learned multiple languages to communicate with diverse masters. They practiced skills that would make them valuable servants while ensuring they could never return to normal life. Hassan was manufacturing perfect slaves through systematic conditioning. The disposal methods Hassan employed for boys who died during or after procedures reveal the industrial scale of his operation. Mass graves outside Constantinople contained thousands of bodies, sorted by age and processing date. Cremation facilities operated continuously to eliminate evidence of failed procedures. River barges carried remains downstream to prevent accumulation near populated areas. Hassan had solved the logistical challenges of mass murder with bureaucratic efficiency. The expansion plans Hassan developed would have multiplied his operations capacity exponentially. Proposed facilities in major cities across the empire would have increased processing capability tenfold. Training academies in regional capitals would have produced hundreds of qualified practitioners. Standardized procedures would have ensured consistent quality regardless of location. Hassan envisioned an empire-wide network of human mutilation centers operating under his supervision. The legacy Hassan left behind continued long after his death in 1547. His students carried his techniques to the furthest corners of the Islamic world. His manuals guided practitioners for centuries after his passing. His business model inspired imitators who established similar operations throughout the Mediterranean. Hassan had created a template for systematic evil that outlived its creator. The Ottoman Empire's investment in Hassan's operation paid dividends that extended far beyond individual transactions. The availability of castrated servants enabled the harem system that concentrated imperial power. The terror inspired by mass castration programs suppressed rebellion in conquered territories. The profits generated funded military campaigns that expanded Ottoman dominion. Hassan's work was integral to the empire's political and economic success. The international implications of Hassan's operation extended Ottoman influence across the known world. Gifts of perfectly trained castrated boys secured diplomatic alliances with distant kingdoms. Trade relationships were cemented through exchanges of human merchandise. Military cooperation was purchased with shipments of mutilated children. Hassan's products became instruments of imperial foreign policy. The religious justifications developed for Hassan's work demonstrate how systematic evil corrupts spiritual authority. Islamic scholars produced theological treatises explaining why castration of non-Muslim boys served God's will. Legal authorities issued rulings that made child mutilation not just permissible but praiseworthy. Religious leaders blessed Hassan's work as service to the faith. The empire had conscripted divine authority to sanctify human destruction. The cultural celebration of Hassan's achievements reveals how completely his society had embraced systematic evil. Poets composed verses praising his skill and dedication. Artists created illustrations depicting his techniques for instructional purposes. Musicians performed compositions celebrating the beauty of castrated boys. The empire had made art from human suffering. The architectural legacy of Hassan's operation included purpose-built facilities that embodied the systematic nature of his work. Recovery wings designed for maximum efficiency in managing mutilated children. Surgical theaters constructed with optimal lighting and drainage for bloody procedures. Administrative offices equipped for managing the paperwork of human trafficking. Hassan's buildings were monuments to organized evil, but we've still only scratched the surface of this historical nightmare. Hassan's individual operation, however vast and systematic, was just one component of an imperial machinery designed to consume human innocence on an unprecedented scale. The techniques he perfected, the systems he established, the legacy he created would continue grinding through children's lives for centuries after his death. The true scope of Ottoman evil stretches far beyond one man's blade, no matter how skillfully wielded or systematically applied. The transformation Hassan wrought upon his victims extended far beyond the physical mutilation itself. The boys who survived his blade faced a psychological reconstruction that was perhaps even more devastating than the surgical trauma. They emerged from his chambers not just physically altered, but mentally reprogrammed into something that could barely be called human. Hassan had perfected the art of destroying souls while keeping bodies functional enough to serve imperial pleasure. The conditioning process Hassan employed began the moment boys regained consciousness after their procedures. Disoriented from blood loss and trauma, they would awaken to find themselves in a world where their previous identities had been surgically removed along with their manhood. Hassan understood that the period immediately following castration represented a crucial window for psychological manipulation, when minds were most vulnerable to reconstruction. The indoctrination chambers Hassan designed served as laboratories for human behavior modification. Boys were isolated from all contact with their former lives, forbidden to speak their native languages, stripped of their birth names, and assigned new identities that reflected their status as imperial property. The systematic erasure of personal history was as methodical as the physical procedures that preceded it. Hassan's assistants, many of them former victims of the same process, served as perfect instruments for breaking new arrivals. These broken men understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of freshly mutilated boys having experienced the same trauma themselves. They could offer false comfort while simultaneously demonstrating that resistance was futile, that the only path to survival lay through complete submission to imperial will. The hierarchy Hassan established within his facility created artificial incentives for cooperation among victims. Boys who demonstrated proper submission received better food, medical care, and living conditions. Those who resisted faced deliberate neglect that often proved fatal. The system taught children to compete for Hassan's approval, turning potential allies against each other in desperate struggles for basic survival. The educational curriculum Hassan developed for his victims focused exclusively on skills that would make them valuable servants, while ensuring they could never function as independent human beings. They learned palace etiquette, but were forbidden knowledge of the outside world. They mastered household management but remained ignorant of basic rights. They acquired multiple languages for communicating with diverse masters, but lost the ability to conceive of freedom. The religious instruction Hassan provided represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of his conditioning program. Boys were taught that their mutilation was God's will, that their suffering served divine purpose, that their degraded status reflected heavenly justice. The empire had weaponized faith itself, using spiritual authority to validate the systematic destruction of human dignity. The graduation ceremonies Hassan conducted marked the final transformation of children into imperial property. Boys who completed their conditioning would be presented to potential buyers in elaborate displays that showcased their training, obedience, and specialized skills. The ritual formalized their transition from human beings to luxury goods, complete with warranties and quality guarantees. The buyer consultation services Hassan provided ensured optimal matching between product and customer. Palace officials seeking bedroom attendants received boys trained in intimate service. Military commanders requiring administrative assistance acquired subjects skilled in record-keeping and correspondence. Wealthy merchants desiring household managers purchased boys educated in domestic supervision. Hassan had customized human merchandise to meet specific market demands. The aftercare programs Hassan established monitored his products long after initial sale. Regular inspections ensured boys remained properly conditioned and hadn't developed dangerous thoughts of independence. Refresher training corrected behavioral drift that might reduce their value. Replacement services addressed customer dissatisfaction with defective merchandise. Hassan treated human beings like complex machinery requiring ongoing maintenance and technical support. The breeding prevention protocols Hassan implemented guaranteed that his victims could never reproduce or form natural family bonds. Beyond the obvious physical impossibility, that the psychological conditioning ensured that castrated boys viewed themselves as fundamentally different from normal humans, incapable of love or meaningful relationships. Hassan had created a permanent underclass of broken servants who could never threaten the social order through biological or emotional connections. The market research Hassan conducted identified emerging trends in customer preferences and adjusted his operations accordingly. When palace fashion favored fair-skinned Circassian boys, his procurement networks shifted focus to the Caucasus region. When military commanders demanded larger, stronger servants, his selection criteria emphasized physical size over beauty. Hassan responded to market forces with the agility of any successful businessman. The quality assurance testing Hassan performed on finished products included rigorous evaluations of obedience, skill retention, and psychological stability. Boys who failed these assessments faced additional conditioning or disposal as defective merchandise. Only those who demonstrated complete submission and perfect training received Hassan's certification for sale to premium customers. The testing process was itself a form of ongoing torture disguised as professional standards. The customer feedback systems Hassan maintained provided valuable data for improving his processes. Buyers who reported problems with purchased boys received immediate technical support and corrective services. Successful placements were analyzed to identify factors contributing to customer satisfaction. Failed products were studied to prevent similar defects in future batches. Hassan had applied modern quality management principles to the business of human destruction. The expansion strategies Hassan developed included franchise opportunities for qualified practitioners throughout the Ottoman territories. Master castrators trained in his techniques could establish satellite operations under his brand name, ensuring consistent quality while expanding market reach. The franchise model would have created an empire-wide network of human mutilation centers operating according to Hassan's standardized procedures. The vertical integration Hassan achieved gave him control over every aspect of the supply chain, from initial procurement to final sale. His agents captured boys in remote villages. His transport specialists moved them efficiently to processing centers. His medical team performed the procedures and managed recovery. His conditioning specialists broke their spirits and rebuilt their personalities. His sales force matched products with customers and provided ongoing support. Hassan had created a completely integrated human trafficking enterprise. The international expansion Hassan pursued extended his operations beyond Ottoman borders into allied and neutral territories. Satellite facilities in Persia processed boys for Middle Eastern markets. North African centers served Mediterranean customers. Eastern European stations supplied Slavic merchandise for discerning buyers. Hassan's brand had achieved global recognition in the luxury market for mutilated children. The technological innovations Hassan sponsored included research into improved surgical techniques, enhanced conditioning methods, and more efficient processing procedures. He funded medical studies aimed at increasing survival rates and reducing recovery times. He supported psychological research focused on breaking human resistance more effectively. Hassan had turned child mutilation into a field of active scientific inquiry. The training academies Hassan established produced hundreds of qualified practitioners who carried his methods to the furthest corners of the Islamic world. Graduates received not just technical instruction, but also business training that enabled them to establish profitable operations in new markets. The curriculum Hassan developed included modules on procurement, processing, conditioning, marketing, and customer service. He had created a comprehensive educational program for systematic human destruction. The legacy documentation Hassan compiled preserved his techniques for future generations of practitioners. Detailed manuals covered every aspect of the castration business, from initial victim selection to final product delivery. Illustrated guides demonstrated proper surgical procedures and conditioning techniques. Case studies analyzed successful and failed operations to identify best practices. Hassan had created a complete library of human mutilation methodology. The professional associations Hassan organized provided ongoing education and networking opportunities for castration specialists throughout the empire. Annual conferences allowed practitioners to share innovations and discuss market trends. Professional journals published research findings and technical improvements. Certification programs ensured consistent standards across different regions. Hassan had established the infrastructure for a permanent community of child mutilators. The political influence Hassan wielded extended far beyond his immediate business operations. His wealth and connections gave him access to the highest levels of imperial government. His expertise was consulted on matters of population control and territorial administration. His success was cited as evidence of Ottoman superiority and divine favor. Hassan had become not just a businessman but a pillar of imperial policy. The cultural impact Hassan achieved transformed Ottoman society's understanding of childhood, masculinity, and human value. His operations normalized the systematic destruction of boys as routine government activity. His success demonstrated that human beings could be manufactured like any other commodity. His legacy embedded the logic of systematic mutilation into the empire's fundamental assumptions about power and dominion. The economic multiplier effects of Hassan's operation extended throughout Ottoman society. The availability of castrated servants enabled luxury lifestyles that drove demand for other goods and services. The profits generated funded military campaigns that expanded imperial territories and created new markets for human merchandise. The system Hassan perfected became integral to the empire's economic growth and political expansion. The social stratification Hassan's work reinforced created permanent caste within Ottoman society based on degrees of human wholeness. Intact males occupied the highest social positions. Castrated servants filled intermediate roles as valuable property. Women and children remained at the bottom as potential resources for future processing. Hassan had helped construct a hierarchy where human worth was measured by the degree of deliberate damage inflicted by imperial authority. The psychological research Hassan conducted revealed insights into human behavior that would have been valuable to modern psychology if applied to constructive purposes. His studies of trauma response, conditioning techniques, and resistance patterns provided detailed maps of human vulnerability and resilience. Unfortunately, Hassan used this knowledge exclusively to perfect methods for breaking children more efficiently. The architectural innovations Hassan introduced included specialized facilities designed specifically for human processing and conditioning. The buildings he constructed embodied principles of control, surveillance, and efficient workflow that would later influence prison design and institutional architecture. Hassan's physical legacy included structures purpose-built for systematic human destruction. The administrative systems Hassan developed managed the complex logistics of industrial-scale child mutilation with bureaucratic precision. Standardized forms tracked each victim from initial capture through final sale. Statistical reports analyzed trends in procurement, processing, and market demand. Financial records documented the profitability of human destruction with accounting practices that would satisfy modern auditors. The international reputation Hassan established made his name synonymous with quality throughout the global market for castrated servants. Foreign dignitaries specifically requested boys processed according to his techniques. Competing operations attempted to copy his methods and trade on his reputation. Hassan had created the first internationally recognized brand in the business of systematic child mutilation. The supplier relationships Hassan maintained with procurement specialists, transport companies, and medical providers created an ecosystem of businesses dependent on the systematic destruction of children. Hundreds of people throughout the empire derived their livelihoods from various aspects of Hassan's operation. The economic incentives he created ensured that his system would persist long after his individual involvement ended. The customer loyalty Hassan built through consistent quality and reliable service created a stable market for his products that transcended individual transactions. Satisfied buyers became repeat customers who recommended his services to colleagues and friends. Word-of-mouth marketing spread Hassan's reputation throughout the empire's elite circles. Customer retention rates in the castrated boy market exceeded those in most other luxury goods sectors. The regulatory framework Hassan helped establish legitimized his operations through formal legal structures that protected his business interests while criminalizing competition from unauthorized practitioners. Imperial licenses granted him exclusive rights to operate in specific territories. Quality standards eliminated inferior operators who might damage the industry's reputation. Professional regulations ensured that only properly trained practitioners could offer castration services. The insurance products Hassan developed protected his operations against various business risks, including transport losses, processing failures, and customer defaults. Policies covered boys who died during shipment, procedures that resulted in death rather than successful castration, and buyers who failed to pay for delivered merchandise. Hassan had applied modern risk management principles to the ancient business of human mutilation. The financial instruments Hassan created facilitated large-scale transactions in human merchandise through credit arrangements, installment plans, and bulk purchase agreements. Wealthy customers could acquire multiple boys through extended payment schedules. Military units could order large quantities for delivery over time. Hassan had developed sophisticated commercial financing for the systematic purchase of mutilated children. The market intelligence Hassan gathered provided detailed analysis of supply and demand trends across different regions and customer segments. His reports tracked seasonal variations in procurement opportunities, identified emerging customer preferences, and predicted future market developments. Hassan had applied modern business analytics to optimize the trafficking and mutilation of human children, but even this comprehensive examination of Hassan's individual operation only begins to reveal the true scope of the systematic evil that characterized Ottoman civilization. His techniques, however refined, his systems, however efficient, his legacy, however enduring, were merely one instrument in an imperial orchestra of human destruction that played its horrific symphony across centuries and continents. The empire Hassan served had institutionalized cruelty on a scale that dwarfs individual atrocities, creating machinery of suffering that ground through millions of lives with bureaucratic precision and religious justification. The question that should haunt us isn't just how one man could perfect such techniques for destroying children. The question is how an entire civilization could build itself around such systematic evil, how they could turn human mutilation into professional education, how they could make the screams of children into the background music of imperial glory. Hassan was both product and producer of a system that had mechanized human suffering to a degree that challenges our ability to comprehend organized evil. The final accounting of Hassan's legacy reveals numbers that should make every civilized person weep. Conservative estimates suggest that during his 27-year career, Hassan personally mutilated over 15,000 boys. 15,000 children who entered his chambers as whole human beings and emerged as broken shells designed to serve imperial pleasure. But even this staggering figure represents only a fraction of the systematic horror he helped institutionalize across the Ottoman Empire. The ripple effects of Hassan's innovations multiplied his individual impact exponentially. The dozens of practitioners he trained went on to establish their own operations throughout the empire. His techniques were copied in processing centers from Cairo to Baghdad. His business model was replicated across 3 continents. Conservative historians estimate that Hassan's direct and indirect influence contributed to the mutilation of over 200,000 boys across the span of Ottoman history. The economic calculations reveal the true scope of this industrialized evil. Hassan's operation generated profits equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern currency. These weren't just individual transactions, but the foundation of an entire economic sector that employed thousands of people across the empire. The systematic destruction of children had become a pillar of Ottoman prosperity, as integral to imperial finance as taxation or trade. The geographic spread of Hassan's influence stretched from the slave markets of Crimea to the auction blocks of Alexandria. His procurement networks operated in dozens of cities. His transport routes crossed mountain ranges and deserts. His distribution channels reached into the most remote corners of the Islamic world. Hassan had created a transcontinental infrastructure for harvesting and processing human children. The temporal scope of his legacy extended far beyond his individual lifespan. The systems he established continued operating for centuries after his death in 1547. The techniques he perfected were still being practiced in some corners of the Islamic world into the 20th century. Hassan had created institutional momentum that carried his evil forward through generations of practitioners who never knew his name but faithfully executed his methods. The documentation that survives from Hassan's operation provides historians with an unprecedented window into systematic evil operating at industrial scale. Ottoman archives contain thousands of pages detailing every aspect of his business, from procurement costs to customer satisfaction surveys. These records read like corporate documents from hell, applying modern business principles to the systematic destruction of human innocence. The psychological studies conducted by Hassan's associates revealed insights into human vulnerability that remain disturbing even by contemporary standards. Their research into breaking children's resistance, conditioning techniques, and long-term behavioral modification would have impressed modern experts in psychological warfare. Unfortunately, this knowledge was applied exclusively to perfecting methods for destroying young minds and spirits. The international networks Hassan established created diplomatic relationships based on shared participation in systematic child abuse. Foreign courts that purchased his products became complicit in Ottoman evil. Trading partners who facilitated his operations shared responsibility for industrial-scale mutilation. Hassan had used human suffering as currency for building international alliances that extended Ottoman influence across the known world. The religious authorities who blessed Hassan's work bear special responsibility for legitimizing systematic evil through spiritual authority. Islamic scholars who produced theological justifications for child mutilation corrupted divine teaching to serve imperial cruelty. Legal experts who ruled such practices permissible under religious law weaponized faith itself against the innocent. The empire had conscripted God to validate the systematic destruction of childhood. The cultural transformation Hassan helped achieve normalized atrocities that should have horrified any civilized society. Ottoman art celebrating castrated boys, literature praising their beauty, music commemorating their service all contributed to making systematic child abuse seem not just acceptable but aesthetically pleasing. Hassan had helped create a civilization that found beauty in broken children. The technological innovations Hassan pioneered in human processing would later influence other forms of systematic oppression throughout history. His methods for managing large numbers of victims, his techniques for psychological conditioning, his systems for quality control and efficiency all provided templates that future perpetrators would adapt for their own purposes. Hassan had contributed to humanity's accumulated knowledge of how to destroy human beings systematically. The educational institutions Hassan established created permanent infrastructure for training future generations of child mutilators. His academies graduated hundreds of practitioners who carried his techniques across the Islamic world. His instructional materials guided countless operations long after his death. Hassan had ensured that his evil would reproduce itself through formal education and professional development. The commercial networks Hassan developed created economic incentives that guaranteed the continuation of systematic child abuse. Hundreds of businesses throughout the empire derived their profits from various aspects of his operation. Thousands of individuals built their livelihoods around the systematic destruction of children. Hassan had embedded his evil so deeply into Ottoman economic life that eliminating it would have required restructuring the entire imperial system. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Hassan's legacy lies not in the individual techniques he perfected or the systems he established, but in how completely his work became normalized within Ottoman society. The empire that honored him with titles and palaces, that celebrated his innovations and copied his methods, that built entire economic sectors around his expertise, reveals the depths to which organized evil can penetrate human civilization. Hassan the Cutter died peacefully in his bed in 1547, surrounded by wealth and honors, celebrated as one of the empire's most successful civil servants. He was buried with full ceremony in a marble tomb that still stands today in Istanbul, its inscription praising his faithful service to Sultan and empire. The man who had spent nearly 3 decades systematically mutilating children was mourned as a pillar of Ottoman society. The boys Hassan destroyed left no monuments, no inscriptions, no memorials. Their names were erased along with their manhood. Their stories were buried along with their broken bodies. They exist now only as entries in Hassan's ledgers, statistical data in his reports, footnotes in the histories that most people never read. The victims of systematic evil rarely leave traces that outlast their destroyers. This is the ultimate lesson of Hassan the Cutter's horrific career. Individual monsters may commit terrible acts, but systematic evil requires the participation of entire civilizations. Hassan could not have operated without the empire that employed him, the bureaucracy that supported him, the society that celebrated him, the customers who enriched him, the religious authorities who blessed him. His evil was possible only because it was institutional, systematic, and normalized. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of children reveals something fundamental about how power operates when unchecked by moral constraints. When human beings become commodities, when childhood becomes a resource to be harvested, when systematic cruelty becomes bureaucratic routine, we see civilization itself transformed into machinery for producing suffering. Hassan was both product and producer of such a system. Today we tell ourselves that such horrors belong to the distant past, that modern civilization has evolved beyond such systematic cruelty. But Hassan's techniques for breaking children were still being practiced in some corners of the world within living memory. The attitudes that enabled his work persist in societies that treat certain populations as less than fully human. The bureaucratic machinery that supported his operations can be found in every government that systematically oppresses vulnerable groups. The true horror of Hassan the Cutter's story isn't just the individual children he destroyed, terrible as that was. The true horror is how his work reveals the capacity of human civilization to normalize, systematize, and celebrate the most extreme forms of evil. His legacy challenges us to recognize that the greatest atrocities in history aren't committed by isolated monsters, but by ordinary people operating within systems that make cruelty seem normal, necessary, and even praiseworthy. We remember Hassan's name today not to glorify his evil, but to understand how such systematic horror becomes possible. His story serves as a warning about what happens when power faces no meaningful constraints, when human beings are reduced to commodities, when systematic cruelty becomes administrative routine. The screams that echoed from his chambers should remind us that civilization itself is always just one generation away from barbarism. The boys who died under Hassan's blade deserve to be remembered not as statistics in imperial ledgers, but as individual human beings whose potential was deliberately destroyed for another man's pleasure. Their suffering was real, their terror was genuine, their lost futures represent incalculable damage to human civilization. They were children who should have grown up to love and be loved, to create and build, to contribute to the great human story. Instead, they became footnotes in the chronicles of systematic evil. Hassan the Cutter stands as a monument to humanity's capacity for organized cruelty, a reminder that the greatest evils in history aren't committed by madmen acting alone, but by skilled professionals operating within systems designed to make horror seem normal. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how civilizations can build themselves around systematic suffering, how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, how bureaucracy can make the unthinkable seem routine. The legacy of Hassan the Cutter should haunt us, not because it represents some ancient horror safely buried in the past, but because it reveals patterns of systematic evil that persist in new forms across time and place. His techniques may be obsolete, but the attitudes that enabled his work live on wherever human beings are treated as commodities, wherever childhood is viewed as a resource to be harvested, wherever systematic cruelty is disguised as administrative necessity. We study Hassan's horrific career not to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to recognize the warning signs of systematic evil before it becomes entrenched, to understand how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary cruelty, to remember that civilization's greatest achievement isn't technological progress or military conquest, but the simple recognition that every human being possesses inherent dignity that must be respected and protected. The children Hassan destroyed cannot be brought back. Their suffering cannot be undone. Their stories cannot be fully told because the systems that destroyed them also erase their memories. But we can honor their memory by ensuring that their fate serves as warning rather than precedent, that their suffering illuminates the darkness rather than disappearing into it, that their destruction teaches us to recognize and resist the systematic evil that still threatens vulnerable populations around the world. Hassan the Cutter's blade fell silent centuries ago, but the echoes of his work remind us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would reduce human beings to commodities, who would systematize suffering, who would make cruelty seem normal. His story challenges us to remain human in systems that encourage us to become monsters, to protect the vulnerable in societies that profit from their exploitation, to remember that our greatest enemy isn't individual evil, but the systematic machinery that makes evil seem ordinary. The screams from Hassan's chambers have long since faded, but they should still ring in our ears as reminders of what happens when civilization fails its most basic obligation to protect the innocent. His legacy stands as eternal warning that the greatest horrors in human history aren't committed by isolated madmen, but by ordinary people operating within systems that make the unthinkable seem routine, necessary, and even praiseworthy.